All right, so we're still in the scheme of redemption. We're in Exodus, and last week we talked through the first 9 plagues. We're not going into a lot of detail. We kind of want to see the broad overview of what's happening here. And I think it's really significant what we need to talk about this morning is that before plague 10, which is the one that probably a lot of us remember really, really well, which is the death of the firstborn, before that plague happened, there were some specific instructions that God tells Moses and Moses tells the people that are going to last for generations and generations and generations. And so I want us to think about, first of all, has the law been given yet? No, the law hasn't been given yet, but some of the things that are here are going to be included in the law later and going to be continued to be passed on for generations and generations. So we've gone through plague 9, but on the night before plague 10, so the night before the death of the firstborn, I think it'd be really good for us just to read through Exodus 12 together. Can we do that? Exodus chapter 12. And then we're going to kind of break up the things that are talked about and are given here and talk about how they connect to Jesus in the very long-term arc of the Bible. So Exodus chapter 12, please. And while you're turning to Exodus chapter 12, we talked about last week how all of the signs and the plagues and the wonders that he did in Egypt were all to show that he is the one true God and was announcing judgment on their false gods, on the false people, on these people who were very unfaithful, just all of that to show that he was the one true God. And even in Romans chapter 9 in the New Testament, it's brought up again. So these amazing things that are done in Egypt are so important even for Christians today. But let's read through Exodus chapter 12 together, please. And I'm reading from the New American Standard this morning, so it might not line up perfectly. So Exodus chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's households, a lamb for each household. Now if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them. According to what each man should eat, you are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th of the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs, along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning, you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall have a holy assembly, and another holy assembly on the 7th day. No work at all shall be done in them, except what must be eaten by every person. That alone may be prepared by you. You shall also observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses. For whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is an alien or a native of the land. You shall not eat anything leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families, and slay the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of that blood that is in the basin, to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts, and none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever.
When you enter the land which the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and they worshiped. I love that line, by the way, just kind of subtly placed in there. They bowed low and worshiped. Verse 28, then the sons of Israel went and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. Now it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go, worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you've said, and go, and bless me also. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. They baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened since they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years, and at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be observed for the Lord, for having brought them out of the land of Egypt. This night is for the Lord, to be observed by all the sons of Israel throughout their generations. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it, but every man's slave purchased with money after you have circumcised him, then he may eat of it. A sojourner or a hired servant shall not eat of it. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside of the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. All the congregation of Israel are to celebrate this. But if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it. He shall be like a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you. Then all the sons of Israel did so. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that same day, the Lord brought the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. I mean, that's an amazing chapter. I know there's like some weird details to kind of just read through, but I think it's really important that we just read what the scriptures say this morning together before we start talking about it. I think that's really, really important. So I kind of want to break it down to a couple of the things that are a little bit separated. So the first thing here is the Passover. The night before the exit of releasing them from the bondage of slavery, the night before, God says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to, he lays out the Passover and exactly how they're going to do this thing. But God is going to demonstrate his grace, his mercy, and his love by using the blood of a lamb as covering to pass over his people so that they won't be the ones that are killed. And he's going to judge Egypt in that way. He's going to spare their firstborns. And we saw in Exodus 12, verse 42, we see it when he's given the actual instructions. This was to be done every year. You know, if something's supposed to be done every year, God usually tells you, do this every year. And he will tell them, and he does. And the Passover feast would be a reminder to them how they were hopeless slaves in Egypt, absolutely hopeless slaves. But God is the one in his love and grace who delivered them through the blood of a lamb. It'd be so important. I love that. And I know you already know this too, but it's just really exciting to talk about. This lamb was to be 1 year old. You can look at that in verse 4, verse 5, 6. And 1 year old without blemishes. They weren't to break any of its bones. We read that at the end of chapter 12. And they were supposed to eat it quickly and be ready to travel. I mean, just think about what was happening here. That very night, we saw in, let's see, where is it? Over in verse 29 and 30. I mean, Pharaoh woke up in the middle of the night. It said there wasn't one home that didn't have somebody dead in it. And they're lamenting, they're wailing. And that very night, get out of here, go, go, go. And so they're eating it in haste. They've got their shoes on. They've got their loins girded. They're eating it like they're ready to go because they got to be ready to go. And it's just an amazing event. Before we even talk about some of the things that point to Jesus in this, anybody have any comments on Passover?
Okay, I'm doing a lot of talking. I did a lot of reading, and now I'm doing a lot of talking. Okay. Okay, well, let's talk about how the Passover relates to Jesus. And it's so clear to us that this is a shadow of Jesus. Look over at 1 Corinthians 5, please. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And over in 1 Corinthians 5, we're going to look at verse 7. We're going to start 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, and then I'm going to try to open it up here and see if we can get some discussion rolling. 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, this is a really important one because it's explicitly mentioned for us. We don't have to make any guesses, and I love stuff like that. I love when I don't have to take a leap of jump anything. You know what I'm saying? So 1 Corinthians 5, look at verse 7, please. Actually, look at verse 6 starting. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ, our Passover, your version might actually say, for Christ, our Passover lamb also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So Paul here, he specifically says that Jesus is the Christian's Passover lamb. Now, what do we think about that? Like, what's the significance of that? Yes, sir.
To me, too, the putting away of leaven it almost represents sin to me, anyway. So when I you take the unleavened bread, I think Christ had no sin. They were keep the leaven away. So I think of that. But I think here specifically, it's just more about his blood covering sins. You know, like the blood on the doorpost to protect the blood of Christ. So I think
yeah, absolutely. And hold on to that leaven idea because we're going to talk about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we're going to come back to this. I mean, spoiler alert already, but absolutely, yeah. And just thinking about in the bondage of Egyptian slavery, God delivers his people by passing over them because the blood of the Lamb covered their household. And so here, Christ is specifically called the Christian's Passover lamb. And the blood of the Passover lamb covers the Christian and allows God, the destroyer, to pass over us and pass over our past sins. It's a wonderful, wonderful idea. Any other thoughts or anything on Passover lamb just from this one so far? Yeah. Yeah, I love that. A new beginning. And there was this very clear sign, something that you need to remember and something that would be repeated over and over and again for their generations. And then we're going to talk about another way that we remember the blood of our Passover lamb again and again and again. Absolutely. Anybody else? Anything else? Okay. Can anybody think of any other passages where Jesus is called a lamb or Passover lamb or the imagery of a Passover lamb is used? John 1:29, absolutely. I don't know who said that, just this direction. But John the Baptist, when he sees Jesus, he says, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. Yeah, John 1:29, absolutely. And that was before people knew who he was going to be, who he is. Yeah. Anything else? Jesus as a lamb. Look over at 1 Peter 1, please. 1 Peter 1. 1 Peter 1, look down at verse 19, please. And 1 Peter 1, we're actually going to read more than verse 19. It's kind of jumping in the middle of a phrase. Look at, start verse 17. 1 Peter 1, start at verse 17. If you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay on earth, knowing that you were not redeemed, I mean, that's our word, redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your feudal way of life inherited from your forefathers, but with precious blood as of a lamb, unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. For he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but has appeared in these last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope
are in God. And I love this because specifically verse 19, the precious blood as of a lamb, unblemished and spotless. If you are a person who knows the old covenant, if you're a person who was of Jewish descent and you read lamb unblemished and spotless, I mean, the first thing you're going to think of is that's the Passover. That's the kind of lamb that we were supposed to have. And Peter says Jesus was that unblemished and spotless lamb. And you've been redeemed with that blood. That blood has covered you in the same way that the blood of the lamb in Exodus covered the households of those Israelites. And I love that. Anybody think of any other lamb passages or comments there? Yes, sir. Yeah, and really the whole book of Revelation is he's referred to as the lamb more than anything else there. And what's fascinating, that's honestly one of my favorite ones. It has to be. In Revelation chapter 5, not only is he viewed as a lamb, but he's viewed as a lamb that was slain. And so again, if to a Jewish audience that Revelation was written to specifically, people who would know the old law, when you read a lamb that was slain, that just shouts out to you, this is the Passover lamb. This is the one that the blood covered our families in the past. And this is what we remember. So now it's the blood that covers the Christian now. Yeah, I love that. I think I said that. That's one of my favorites in Revelation. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Really, Hebrews 8 through 10, that entire section. I mean, we could block that off as Jesus is the fulfillment of the old law in a better way than the old law even had. He's called the high priest specifically. I don't know if he is called the lamb specifically, but the idea is absolutely there. That's a great one to bring up. One sacrifice for all time rather than the repeated daily sacrifices that were needed to atone for people. Okay, any other thoughts on lambs? Okay, well, I hope that we will see I don't even know if I have like an arc here. Okay, cool. We got an arc there. We're going to talk about why it's connected to water in just a second. But with the Passover, I hope that we see the Passover lamb in the Old Testament allowed the destroyer to pass over the household of those people. And God delivered his people through the blood of a lamb in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament here in Exodus. And I hope that we see that in the New Testament, the new covenant under Jesus is that the blood of the lamb causes God's judgment to pass over us as well. And that's what gives us life, how we're delivered from our bondage of slavery and sin. And we can go to Romans chapter 6 for that. I know a lot of us like Romans chapter 6, where we've been released from sin. What we usually don't like to talk about at the end of Romans chapter 6 is we've been released from slavery of sin, and now we become slaves of righteousness because we want to be slaves of righteousness. But also, yeah. Okay, any other thoughts on the Passover? There's a lot more we could talk about, but the Passover, yes, sir.
So in Exodus, it was conditional. If you don't do this, this will happen. Your firstborn will die. Just like in the New Testament, if you don't do this, you will be destroyed. So, I mean, there's similarities.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. Absolutely, because it took, what we've been talking about this whole time is that God has always required people to respond to his grace with faith. Because that's sort of a weird command, don't you think? I mean, like if somebody told me today, hey, if you want the Steelers to win on Wednesday, go kill a lamb and put it on your doorpost. I'd be like, okay, that's sort of a weird thing to do. But they did, and that's absolutely right. Yes, sir?
Yeah, that's what Hebrews 11 says. By faith, he instituted the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch it.
Yeah, let's go. By faith, by faith. And we've been going to Hebrews 11. That's almost been our timeline. Keep going back to Hebrews 11. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, any other thoughts on the Passover? Okay. Well, let's talk about circumcision now. So we noticed in Exodus chapter 12, as we read through it, there's several things about circumcision here. What's interesting is this the first time we see circumcision in the scriptures up to this point? No, we saw it with Abraham and all of his descendants, right? That's what we saw. But here it's repeated. And notice that the Passover, let's look at Exodus 12 again, and in verses 43 through 49 at the end of the chapter. Did you notice only those who have been circumcised were allowed to eat the Passover? So the Passover, as special as it is, not anybody could eat the Passover. Only those who were circumcised could eat of the Passover. It's the sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. It was a continual reminder of their relationship with God. It was an act of faith. Speaking of conditional type of thing, I mean, that's another really kind of weird command
although it was actually really common in Egypt, fun fact, but which Dan told me that. It was common in Egypt. It's sort of a weird command, though, but God always requires people to respond in faith to his grace. And without faith, this is just a physical cutting. It's just a physical maiming. There's nothing special at all about it if it's without faith. And what's amazing here is if we look at verses 43 through 49 again, look at verse 48 and 49 again. Verse 48, if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you. So what's amazing about this, there's a lot of people who will say that in the old law and the old covenant, the Old Testament, that Gentiles were 100% excluded, not one person, unless you were of Jewish ethnicity, not one person could join the fold. And that's just not what we see. If people responded to God's grace with faith and lived the way that God was prescribing to them, they could do this stuff. Gentiles could be added into the fold. Isn't that amazing to anybody? Because it seems like we talk a lot about that under the new covenant. We see a lot of really explicit, specific demands and commands about how I'm thinking about Peter when he sees that image of the unclean animals, and God's like, well, I've called clean, don't call unclean, that kind of thing. We see that. But even in the old covenant, we see where people who weren't of Jewish ethnicity or Jewish descent, they could join the fold. They could join into this if they responded to God with faith and followed what he said. It's amazing to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. If they committed to the covenant, God accepted them. Yeah, and that goes back to what you were saying too. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yeah, for sure. The inclusion of slaves, really important too. And the idea is every single person in your household, like if you're a leader of a household, your household is going to be committed to my covenant, and you're going to show that. Abraham showed that whenever God told him that circumcision would be the sign of the covenant. Everybody in his household that day. So yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts here? Yes, sir.
What's amazing is the next time we will see them circumcise and celebrate Passover is in Joshua 5. Because there's a whole generation that goes without being circumcised. And so the implication is that they also were not examining the Passover. They wouldn't have been allowed to. And so it's just powerful to think about that. If there is a notation of where they celebrate the Passover, someone can point that out. But this will be kind of the one and done. And then when they get in the wilderness, their children are not celebrating the Passover because they're not getting circumcised. And it's not until Joshua 5 that generation does and gets to celebrate the Passover. So Israel's going to be short-sighted with this. And it's cool to think about the next generation getting to do this for the first time.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. One of the things that we've been noticing throughout is how even these major characters and players that are in the scriptures, they are not the solutions to the problem of sin. Even though God works his purpose through them, they're not the solution. Just speaking of circumcision as an example, just last week we talked about Moses and how God talked to Moses from the burning bush and said, you are going to deliver my people out of Egypt. And then what happens in the very next chapter? God was waiting to what? He was waiting to kill him, because even Moses, the guy that is in Hebrews 11 several times in several verses, even Moses had not circumcised his son. And so Zipporah has to do that act and says, you become a husband of blood to me, and throws it at his feet. And even Moses wasn't the solution to the problem of sin, although God is going to use him to bring about that solution. And just like you were saying, the nation of Israel is not the solution to the problem of sin. Through them, God is going to bring the solution, which is Jesus, which is why all of our things have been pointing to Jesus. So spoiler alert, anytime you see a circle with an icon in it, it's going to point to Jesus at some point. So there you go.
Any other thoughts on circumcision so far? Thank you all for the comments. This has been really good. Okay, now let's talk about how circumcision relates in the new covenant, talking about connecting these arrows and how we think about these things. Remember, circumcision was never really about the physical act of circumcision. We've talked about that. It wasn't just the cutting of the foreskin. It wasn't about that. It was about the faith of the people doing that, responding to God's grace and to his commands. Moses actually tells them in Deuteronomy 10:16, there's this phrase that keeps showing up, circumcise your hearts. He was like, don't worry about, I mean, they did have to worry about the physical act, but he's saying that's not the point. Circumcise your hearts. In Deuteronomy 30, Moses tells them God will circumcise your hearts if you give your hearts to God. So that was the purpose there. In Jeremiah chapter 4, it says, Jeremiah tells the people to circumcise their hearts. And the whole point there is it's an act of faith and a symbol of devotion to God's covenant, to God's will, and sort of releasing yourself from the control and giving it over to God. So let's look over at Romans chapter 2, please. Romans chapter 2, please. And we'll look down at verse 29 specifically. But in Romans chapter 2, this whole chapter is really about sort of unrighteous judgment and how the law was used for the Jews. And in chapter 3, he's going to talk about how the Jews had such an advantage because they had the law, but not even the Jews could follow it. They weren't following it. They weren't being faithful to the covenant. And then in the end of Romans chapter 2, look down at, let's see, let's look at verse 27. 27. He who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, so who are we talking about there? Physically uncircumcised, we're talking about Gentiles. And if the Gentiles keep the law, he will not judge you, who though having the letter of the law and circumcision are a transgressor of the law. So the here in this verse is someone who's a Gentile but keeping the law, even though they're not a Jew. And then you've got someone who's a Jew who's physically circumcised, but they're a transgressor. They're not keeping the law. So look at verse 28. He is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But, verse 29, he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God. And what Paul is doing there is he's really contrasting the Jews from the Gentiles and saying, okay, here's the Gentiles who weren't specifically given the law, and yet sometimes they follow it without even knowing they're following it. And here's the Jews who have the law, who should know it, who should have everything, they have every advantage, as chapter 3, verse 1. What advantage has the Jew? What benefit is circumcision? Great in every respect, is what Paul says. They have this advantage, but the Jews who have the law, who are physically circumcised, they're not keeping the law. Their hearts are far from me, we might say. And so he's saying it's really not about the physical cutting then. So then verse 29, circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit. It's not about the physical cutting, it's about the heart and giving yourself over to God in that way. Any thoughts on this? Okay. Take a look over at Colossians 2, please. Colossians chapter 2. And over in Colossians 2, we'll look at verses 11 and 12 specifically. Colossians 2, we'll look at verses 11 and 12 specifically. These are some of I say this about a lot of passages. These are some of my favorite verses where it's in him and then tell me about Jesus. And in him, tell me about the stuff we get from Jesus. And it's a wonderful passage. But here in verses, let's look at verse 9. It's just too good not to read it. Verse 9. In him, in Jesus, all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. In him, in Jesus, you have been made complete. And he is the head over all rule and authority. And in him, verse 11, he's talking to Christians here. It's really important. Verse 11, he says, in him, you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. So verses 11 and 12, we see that in Jesus, if you're a Christian, you've been circumcised with a circumcision made without hands. Like, what are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? What do you think?
Heard somebody whisper, and it's really cool that we don't really have to guess because it's in the next verse. You've been circumcised with the circumcision made without hands and the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. And so sort of the parallel in the New Testament, the new covenant is baptism. It's not about the physical act of getting dunked in water and then coming back up. That's not what it's about. But it's actually about what it says in verse 12. It is being raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. Just like circumcision was not about the physical act, but about giving themselves to God in faith, so too is baptism. It is a physical act, but it's all about God working in that physical act as we demonstrate our faith. Okay, any thoughts or anything on that? I mean, that's amazing, is it not? Yes, sir.
It's the idea of cutting out the bad,
Yeah.
cutting off the part of us that doesn't belong. And God having a hand in that as well, of removing the filthiness of ourselves and then coming to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also why there's a lot of people who will say, if you worship in a building that has Church of Christ on the sign, they believe that you have to be baptized by a COC elder, which I've never heard that before until I talked to other people about it. And it's like, that's not really that important because it's the working of God, not the person dunking. I don't know why I just brought that up here. I just thought that was appropriate. Okay, any other thoughts or anything on circumcision?
You were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh. You were living in fleshly life.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to cut that off. That's the circumcision we have. And we've got to forgive all of our fleshly transgressions.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's cutting off.
Yeah, and Dan just brought up verse 13, if you didn't hear that, talking about how we cut off the sins of our fleshly life. And that's through that whole process. Yeah, absolutely. And then God forgives us of all our transgressions there at the end of verse 13. Yes, sir?
And Christians, they had a hard time grasping this.
Yeah, they did.
We see multiple times, like, I think Paul says it a lot, like, they're trying to force the Gentiles to be circumcised because you have to be, that's what the law says, but how many times does Paul say, no, that's not, you're missing a point.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I wonder sometimes if we accidentally can become Judaizing teachers in the same kind of way. If we focus on the physical act of things more so than God working through that physical act as a demonstration of our faith. Yeah, absolutely. And it was almost more of a cultural thing for them, even more so than the command that God actually gave. Like, this is a sign that you're committed to me. And they were just like, well, you got to do it. Like, everybody, you just got to do it. I mean, that's just part of it. But yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? I thought I heard somebody else saying something. Maybe I made that up. Sir?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
All right. Just a hearty amen, huh? All right. Okay. Anything else on circumcision? Yes, sir. Mhm.
Settles the matter, and then they write the letter back to the hand. So this is such.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not told that there was any kind of counsel among the apostles or anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, he just brought up that there was a sort of a council in Jerusalem about this very idea, that it was a really hard thing for them to grasp, and kind of squashed that whole idea and sent that letter out. And then I'm just thinking about Peter, for example, too. I mean, Peter is the one that, Acts 10, he's the one that goes out to Cornelius. God shows him this sign. But then we know later on, even Peter is still having a problem with associating with Gentiles and sticking to the things of Judaism. And yeah, peer pressure, sure. So even Peter, and again, as we've been talking about, these major characters and major players we see in the Bible, they're not the solution. They're just part of God working out his perfect plan. The only solution is Jesus, and that's where all these things are pointing to. Okay, any other thoughts? Circumcision?
There's a lot in Exodus 12, isn't there? And we can keep talking about the Passover. We keep talking about circumcision. Okay, let's talk about the other thing that was in Exodus chapter 12. There's two more really big things. In Exodus 12, Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we already got a little spoiler alert earlier in the class, which is great. I love that we're making these connections early. In Exodus chapter 12, there were 7 days of this feast, and I'm going to connect when the law is given later, some of the commands that are given in the law later, because the 7 days of this feast were just bathed in blood. Each day would have had 11 animal sacrifices in addition to the 2 regular burnt offerings and then double offerings for the Sabbath. You can look over at Numbers 28 to see those details, Numbers 28 in the law. But this feast just had redemption all over it. I mean, just the smell of smoke and burning flesh would have filled people's noses for 7 days. Hey, could you imagine that smell? That wouldn't be pleasant. And that's sort of the idea is these are for sins. These are for all these things. It was a reminder to the people of their helplessness in Egypt and God's mercy and his grace to bring them out of that slavery. Let's see here in verse, where is it? God specifically says the purpose here. I love, it's at the end of, look at verse 25 and 26. Verse 26, when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? This is talking specifically about the Passover. Verse 27, you shall say it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and they worshiped. I love that. So when they're asking about what are all of these things, like what's the purpose of this? It's supposed to be a reminder how the Lord brought them out. Look at chapter 13 with me, please. Let's start in verse 3. Chapter 13, we'll start in verse 3 because this gives us more about the actual Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we're going to see a similar statement to what we just read about the Passover, about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Verse 3, Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out from Egypt, from the house of slavery, for by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out from this place, and nothing leavened shall be eaten. On this day in the month of Abib, you are to go forth. It shall be when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall observe this rite in this month. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten throughout the 7 days, and nothing leavened shall be seen among you, nor shall any leaven be seen among you in all your borders. You shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Also, side note, verse 8, I love the personalization of that. Like that was for the whole nation. But when your son asks you, this is what the Lord did for me when he brought us out of Egypt. Love that. Okay, verse 9. It shall serve as a sign to you on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a powerful hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Therefore you shall keep this ordinance at its appointed time from year to year. Now when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and your fathers and gives it to you, you shall devote to the Lord the first offspring of every womb, and the first offspring of every beast that you own. The males belong to the Lord. But every first offspring of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, then you shall break its neck, and every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And I mentioned those redemption firstborn verses on purpose, because we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But this Feast of Unleavened Bread, why was it unleavened bread? We read it in Exodus chapter 12. Why unleavened bread? Yeah. Isn't that, I mean, really, it's an amazing story. Like it's a physical reminder of we had to make this in haste. We didn't have time to let this thing rise. We had to get out of Egypt because they were sending us out. And I love that. And this reminder of with the unleavened bread, just the bread itself would be a reminder of we had to get out because God was delivering us. I love that. This feast here, love that. And so this feast would be a reminder for these 7 days, these tons of sacrifices would have been made every day. It would have been a reminder again of their helplessness in Egypt and God's mercy and his grace in taking them out so that when their children ask them, they will say, this is what the Lord did for me in bringing us out of Egypt. Love that. Okay, any thoughts on unleavened bread before we talk about New Covenant unleavened bread? Okay, sir.
I think there's a second aspect of this, that these two ideas are related, that God brought them out of Egypt. But it also is the fact that God brought them to Canaan. Mm. And it specifies that God did not take them the short route, that would have taken a few weeks at the most to travel up. Instead, took us right through the wilderness. Even if they had immediately gone into the land, when God brought them to the southern border, it still was several months, in fact, over a year they spent in Sinai. The point is that God provided for them all through this way they could not have provided for themselves. And the obvious application that I see to us is to recognize that the more comfortable we are in this world, the more we feel like, because I've worked hard, because I've saved up, because I've set aside my retirement, that I've done this. And the harder it is for us to appreciate what God has done. And this Feast of Unleavened Bread was a reminder to them that God has done every bit of this, even when they were in this land flowing with milk and honey, and they were incredibly wealthy and protected from all their enemies. They still need to remember God did every bit of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when we see crossing the Red Sea, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, there's that whole entire idea that we could not do this on our own. Without a doubt, we could not do this on our own. So yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts or anything? Okay, well, we already talked about 1 Corinthians 5, and because the bell's rung, I really want to get to law of the firstborn. Let's just kind of recap what we talked about in 1 Corinthians 5, 7 through 8, where it's talking about clean out the leaven. And in the context there, it's talking about in 1 Corinthians, there's someone who is sleeping with your own mother or mother-in-law. You have your husband's wife, your father's wife. There's a whole big problem. And it seems like they were almost boasting that they were being so tolerant and letting that person be in their number. And Paul says, your boasting is not good. Clean out the old leaven. Don't you know a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And that's the whole idea there. And that's when he says, for Christ, our Passover has been slain. Our Passover lamb has been slain. So clean out the old leaven, new leaven, all that stuff. And that really is a big reminder of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where they were told, get all of the leaven out of your house. Don't let it be seen anywhere with you. Don't eat anything that's leavened. Get it out of your house. And so the idea for New Covenant Christians is, if there's leaven in your life, if there's sin in your life, get it out. It can't be seen among your people. And God is the one who saves you, but get that leaven out of your life. Okay, any thoughts or anything? That's like a really rough, fast summary there. And again, we can go to Hebrews 8 through 10, as we talked about earlier in the class, but how Jesus is the fulfillment of so many things of the law, and it's amazing. Okay, any other thoughts? Okay, let's talk about law of the firstborn really quick. So in Exodus 13, we read a couple of these verses, and these were perpetual actions of faith. The male firstborns of people and animals were to be devoted to God. Later on, when the law is given, we actually see where the Levites are used as a substitute for the firstborns. But since the Levites' numbers weren't enough to account for all of the people, they would have to redeem firstborns with financial offerings. And we also see where we read it there in, let's see, Exodus 13. We read it with the donkeys. They had to redeem with a lamb. There were certain animals they had to redeem with a lamb. But this whole idea, law of the firstborn, you think about what just happened in the 10th plague. The firstborns of the Egyptians were just killed as a sign of judgment against the false gods of the land, against Pharaoh himself. And just for really quick, I want to talk about Pharaoh's son himself was viewed, I think we talked about this last week. Pharaoh's son himself was viewed as sort of a prince god because he was going to be the next Pharaoh, firstborn son. Can I tell you something fascinating about like archaeological history? I just saw this last night. This is wild. So Amenhotep II is usually the one that we pick out as being the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep II. He had a son named Amenhotep. I don't remember the number after it, but his firstborn son's name was Amenhotep. And we have records that he had a first son, Amenhotep. The next Pharaoh of Egypt was Thutmose IV. And what's fascinating about this, you all know the Sphinx, right? Like the cat thing. Well, in its elbows, there's this giant stone. It's called the Dream Stela, something like that. On that is this whole account of Thutmose IV. And he says, I was out hunting and I had this divine vision that if I cleaned out the sand from under the Sphinx, then I would be the next divine ruler. And so what's fascinating about that is, for someone to become the Pharaoh, they would have understood, okay, firstborn son is already the divine prince. So once that Pharaoh goes into the next world, then this one will become the next Pharaoh. But here's Thutmose IV, who has no natural right to be the Pharaoh just by his birth order.
And so he has to have this sort of divine vision and this divine reason why he's going to be the next Pharaoh. What's fascinating about Amenhotep II's son, Amenhotep, you can find that he was born, that he was a real person, but then he just disappears from history. So the firstborn son of Pharaoh just disappears from history and they don't mention him again. Thutmose IV has to have this divine vision in order to take the throne. And so a lot of people point to that and they say, okay, so that's probably because firstborn son of Pharaoh was killed, 10th plague. And so the next son in the line had to say, here's this divine reason why I became Pharaoh. Is that fascinating to anybody, or is it just me? Okay, that's fascinating. All right, we'll talk more about law of the firstborn and hopefully get to the tabernacle next Sunday. Thank you all very much.